part 3, and I know this imagery is kind of rough. I do understand that. So some of the stuff is hard for me to look at times too. But this chapter should be the end, I believe. We kind of lighten up, as it were, after this. But our author in particular, she's very political. She's a professor at USC, and that's kind of her particular viewpoint. Okay, so woman with colloidal scars. These are some photographs of victims of the bombing of Nagasaki. Hiroshima is probably the one you've heard of, ending World War II. The Japanese did not or would not surrender. The emperor wouldn't say it was done, and that made the U.S. feel justified in trying out a nuclear weapon for the first time, and it was devastating. So the use of atomic weaponry has always, that's what the Cold War is, the idea that we would actually do it, and it could devastate the entire world. Now, one thing about the atomic bomb is that no one really knew what would happen, and the testing that they did prior to this was kind of limited, some of which was in New Mexico and Nevada. But at any rate, they bomb Hiroshima, and then a little bit later they bomb Nagasaki, both of which had to be completely rebuilt. So what's happening here is this beautiful photograph with these rich, blacks and whites are showing this horrifying scar. And Senji, the person we have a photograph of, suffered, throughout her life, or his life, I'm not sure on this, but yeah, it's something that was very difficult to live through. Many people in Japan of this time period that were nearby died of cancer if they didn't have any visible scarring. So the atomic radiation that was there sort of permeated the culture. So this is a protest against U.S. troops stationed in Japan for decades after this. I believe we still do have bases in Japan, and this was kind of a protest against the atomic bombing at that time. Okay, another disturbing image that we have, Mercenaries 1. Leon Golub was a very prominent painter in the 1970s, a big name in painting. And we get back, remember how we were saying abstract expressionist was so huge? See how there's kind of that influence in the background? And then we get into somewhat a realistic portrayal, but still kind of, abstracted figures and so on in this piece. So one of the things that's happening very much so in the 1970s, on and off, the prior to that, so like the CIA is coming to the rise, and mercenaries are people that are hired. They're soldiers. They're not guns for hire as in terms of gangsters or private in a way. What they are is people who do things behind the scenes. Have you ever heard that term, like black ops or something like that? That's kind of what they're talking about. These guys that show up, usually on behalf of the U.S. We employed a good number of these fellows. And we would say, okay, could you work in this war? Could you work in that war? And they're not officially soldiers. Sometimes they're former soldiers. They have some kind of military training. And they will torture and harm the people that we're trying to get information from. But it sort of goes off the books. So Leon Golub is protesting this, and he's really trying to overwhelm us because this is an 11-foot high painting by, I don't know how wide it is, must be like 14, 15 feet. But you're on the level of the victim, it's up high, so you're personifying or you're identifying with this person here as is intended by the artist. So you're trying to feel what that pain of that suffering of that tortured victim is. Thick paint has been scraped, so it seems really raw. The victim has no identifying traits, and it just looks really repulsive and jarring and acidic. Now, I think prior to this class, maybe you were thinking most artwork is pretty or beautiful, and I know that sometimes you guys write in words in that way, but that is not how all artwork is made. That is not the intention. A lot of times it's made to really shock us and disturb us, and this is definitely the case in this point in time. Okay. Now going into something that's mixing beauty and destruction together, we get into Delacroix, the liberty leading the people. Now, this is after Goya, perhaps influenced by Goya to some degree. We have this guy who his pants have been removed. He's got one sock on, one sock off. His shirt is open. He's dead. There's a lot of death down here. And then there's people protesting and so on. And what this is showing is some hope, as opposed to some of the other pieces that we looked at that are somewhat hopeless. So Liberty is leading the people. She's kind of like a Greek goddess or a Roman goddess. We can see that by the clothing of those ropes. That's very typical of that time. She's a mythological figure. She's just sort of standing on, we don't even know what. There's not like a real thing there. And she's holding that French flag saying we can survive this. So she's trying to pull up the repressed people because they were fighting against the elite at that time, the people in government, and the idea behind Delacroix's painting is that beauty can be effective in protest art, and so she's oblivious to the danger. She's just keeping going. So we have realism, idealism, and romanticism here. Romanticism is a look back to the past, which she is a past classical figure, so that's romanticism. Idealism, in that she is idealized and that you're thinking about some idealistic notions here. Romanticism also is these clouds back here, the way these clouds are depicted. And then realism, in terms of like every person is depicted clearly with shadows, very realistically, but realism also meant depicting common people. All right, Louis Hine, Leo, 48 inches high, 8 years old. So this is a sad situation of child labor. So this is a protest, a photograph taken in 1910. And again, the Industrial Revolution changes the world in many ways, not so good, some not so good. And before laws went into place a little bit after this time, partly to do with photographs such as these, children were sent down in mines and textile mills because their little fingers were really great at getting into small things or small areas of work that other people couldn't get into, and like a mine or a shaft would be really narrow. And there was no limit on hours. Like, people would not take set breaks. You know how like you have a lunch hour or a timed coffee break, or you leave at 5 p.m. You would work for 12 or 14 hours a day with like maybe 20-minute break. It's crazy what responding to a machine, and the machine can go 24 hours a day. So what the owners of these factories are thinking is that we have to have 24 hours worth of workers there. So they thought perhaps that's 2 people in a day. Well, now we have shifts that we call, it has to be 8 hours. So, and there's overtime and things like that. Well, that didn't happen back then. So child labor is one thing, overworking the workforce, but a lot of children were killed or hurt during this time. He's dodging underneath to pick up loose thread spools. That's very dangerous. The machine is still moving, and so he's trying to get down in there and get those bobbins, these little, if you've ever seen like a spool of thread on a bobbin, that's what a bobbin is. Well, it's a little bit different than that, but at any rate, I'll just put it that way. And so he's chasing around and getting these things because he's small, but he could easily be hurt, okay? So trying to publish this and get people, to get some laws passed. So eventually it was outlawed in 1930s. So it took a long